Hello and welcome. Tonight, we're going to take a peaceful journey through one of the most powerful and inspiring stories in the Bible, the life of Moses. This is not just a story of miracles and ancient lands, but a quiet, calming tale of courage, hope, and faith that has carried through generations. As you get cozy in bed, let your body relax and your mind settle. This is your time to unwind, to let go of the day, and gently drift into sleep as we walk through this timeless story, together slowly, calmly, one chapter at a time. Imagine a time long ago when the golden sands of Egypt shimmered under the hot sun and the great river Nile flowed quietly through the land, giving life to everything it touched. In this ancient kingdom, powerful and mysterious, the people of Israel, also known as the Hebrews, found themselves living as strangers, far from their ancestral home. They had arrived in Egypt many generations before, welcomed because of the wisdom of Joseph, who once interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh himself. But those days of favor and comfort were only a memory now. With each passing year, the Hebrews multiplied, and their numbers grew, filling the land with laughter, new births, and hope for the future. Yet, what should have been a blessing became the source of fear for a new Pharaoh, one who did not remember Joseph, nor the good he had brought to Egypt. He saw the Hebrews not as neighbors, but as a threat, a people who might one day rise against him. To control them, Pharaoh made the Hebrews slaves, forcing them to build cities and monuments beneath the relentless Egyptian sun. Their days were filled with the clatter of bricks, the ache of tired bodies, and the feeling that hope was slipping away. Even then, the people kept growing. Fear twisted Pharaoh's heart even tighter, leading him to declare a chilling order. Every Hebrew baby boy must be thrown into the Nile, erased before he could ever grow to be a man. This cruel law cast a shadow over every home, making joy in birth quickly turn to fear. Yet, even in such a dark and dangerous time, life found a way. In a small home hidden among the bustling city, a Levite woman discovered she was to have a child. She felt the tiny kicks and fluttering heartbeat within her, and though she knew the risk, she hoped against hope for her baby's safety. When the time came, she gave birth to a beautiful, healthy boy. The moment she saw him, her heart overflowed with love, a love so fierce and tender, it pushed back against the fear that gripped the land. For 3 months, she and her husband hid their son, wrapping him in quiet lullabies and hushed whispers, protecting him from the eyes of soldiers and neighbors who might betray them. But as the baby grew stronger and his cries grew louder, it became harder to keep him hidden. Each day, the risk grew greater. The mother knew she could not hide him forever, but she could not give up hope either. So, with trembling hands and a heart full of courage, she wove a small basket from reeds, coating it with pitch and tar to make it watertight. She laid her sleeping baby inside, kissed his brow, and covered him with a soft cloth. Early in the morning, before the world was fully awake, she carried the basket to the edge of the Nile. The river's waters glistened in the dawn, and she set the little boat gently among the reeds, trusting the currents to keep her child safe. Nearby, her daughter Miriam watched over the basket, ready to see what would become of her little brother. The mother walked away, her heart torn between despair and hope, knowing she had done all she could to give her son a chance at life. The basket bobbed gently among the rushes, cradled by the river, as the city slowly came to life around them. In the hush of the morning, while all Egypt went about its daily toil, a mother's hope floated quietly, a small miracle adrift on the water, waiting for what would come next. As the Nile flowed gently under the morning sun, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The basket, hidden among the reeds at the water's edge, drifted quietly, its precious cargo fast asleep inside. The air was warm and still, heavy with the scent of river lilies and the faint sounds of distant voices. Birds called softly as they swooped across the water, and small fish stirred just beneath the surface. Time seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something extraordinary to unfold. It was then that the calm of the river was interrupted by the soft laughter and chatter of women approaching the water's edge. These were not ordinary women coming to draw water or wash clothes. Among them walked the daughter of Pharaoh, cloaked in the grace and beauty of Egyptian royalty. Adorned in fine linen, with gold bracelets glinting in the sunlight, she strolled along the banks with her attendants, seeking a quiet moment to bathe away from the bustle of the palace. The princess, curious and compassionate, had a keen eye for detail and noticed the unusual shape nestled among the tall reeds. Drawing closer, she paused, her gaze lingering on the basket. She gestured to one of her maidservants, who waded carefully into the water and brought the mysterious bundle to shore. The princess leaned in, her heart suddenly pounding with anticipation. Lifting the cloth, she found a tiny baby boy, wide-eyed and vulnerable, his soft cries echoing gently over the water. Tears welled up in her eyes as she recognized that this must be a Hebrew child, a boy marked by the edict of her own father, doomed by a cruel law yet delivered to her by the river itself. In that moment, pity and wonder filled her soul, washing away the fear and indifference that palace life often brought. The baby's cries stirred something deep inside Hera, longing to protect, to nurture, to give this little one a life beyond sorrow. Even as the palace guards looked on, the princess reached out, lifting the baby into her arms, gently cradling him against her heart. The child's sobs quieted, soothed by the warmth and safety of her embrace. The attendants looked at one another in surprise, for none dared question the princess's compassion, though they knew the risks that came with defying the pharaoh's decree. It was then that Miriam, the baby's sister, who had watched everything unfold from a distance, stepped forward with great courage. She approached the princess and asked if she would like her to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. The princess, grateful and quick-witted, nodded her approval. Miriam hurried away, her heart pounding with hope, and soon returned with her own mother. Without revealing her identity, the mother stood before the princess, and the baby was placed back in her loving arms. The princess spoke softly, asking her to care for the child until he was old enough to come live at the palace. She even promised to pay her for this precious work. The mother's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude, for her son was not only safe, but would now have the chance to grow strong and healthy, surrounded by both the love of his family and the protection of royalty. For a time, the mother kept her son hidden, cherishing each day, every smile, every tiny hand wrapped around her finger. She watched as he grew, his spirit bright and curious, his laughter echoing through their small home. She whispered ancient stories to him at night, stories of Abraham and Isaac, of promises made and hopes yet to come. When the day arrived for the child to return to the palace, the mother's heart ached with the pain of letting go, yet she knew that her son was destined for something far greater than she could imagine. The princess welcomed him with open arms and gave him the name Moses, because, she said, I drew him out of the water. From that moment, Moses was raised among marble halls and lush gardens, dressed in fine clothes and taught by the greatest teachers in the land. Yet deep inside, he would always carry with him the quiet strength and faith of his mother, the gentle touch of the river, and the kindness of a princess who dared to show mercy in a world ruled by fear. The river, which had once seemed a place of danger and despair, became a symbol of hope and new beginnings. And as the sun set over the waters that night, the story of Moses was just beginning, a story shaped by courage, love, and the mysterious way in which fate can turn even the darkest moments into the dawn of something wonderful. Moses grew up surrounded by the splendor and majesty of Egypt, his days unfolding within the echoing halls of Pharaoh's palace, where sunlight streamed through carved pillars and the air carried the fragrance of exotic flowers from palace gardens. Tutors taught him the mysteries of reading and writing in the hieroglyphs that lined temple walls. He learned to count and measure, to observe the stars, and to recite the stories of Egypt's many gods, gods whose statues towered over the courtyards and whose names were whispered in rituals and prayers. The royal artisans showed him how to work gold, the scribes taught him to keep records, and wise counselors explained the ways of government and power. Moses dined at great tables covered in figs and honey, and sat beside the princes and princesses of Egypt, his face familiar in every corner of the palace. Servants hurried at his call, and the best clothes and chariots were his to enjoy. He wore the jewelry of the royal household and, in every outward way, appeared to be just another Egyptian noble, destined perhaps for a high place among Pharaoh's trusted advisors. Yet behind the walls and beyond the river lay a different world, a world Moses could never truly leave behind. He was never allowed to forget the gentle hands that had rocked him to sleep in those early years, the loving gaze of his true mother, and the songs she sang in a language older than Egypt itself. Though he was called a prince, in his heart he carried a deep and quiet knowledge. He was not born of Pharaoh's blood, but of the Hebrew people, who toiled in the fields and brick pits. When he looked out from the palace balconies, he sometimes caught glimpses of them at their workmen and women, hunched under heavy loads, children running barefoot in the dust, overseers shouting orders and snapping their whips. He watched as the Hebrews carried stones for the building of new cities, their faces worn and weary, and wondered what their lives must be like at the end of each day. Sometimes, a whisper of Hebrew words would drift up from the streets, tugging at memories that had never quite faded. Inside Moses, questions began to grow, questions about who he really was, where he truly belonged, and what his life was meant to become. He felt the pull of two worlds. The luxury and power of Egypt could not erase the longing to understand his roots, or the sympathy he felt for his people's suffering. In secret moments, he listened for tales of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, stories of a God who watched over his people even in exile, stories he had first heard as a small child nestled in his mother's arms. The palace was full of knowledge, but it did not answer the quiet ache that stirred within him at night, as he wondered why he had been spared and what purpose might lie behind the path his life had taken. As Moses grew into a young man, his strength and wisdom became known throughout Egypt. He rode at the head of processions, stood beside Pharaoh in ceremonies, and was respected for his judgment and kindness. Yet, even in moments of triumph, he could not shake the feeling of being a stranger in a foreign land, walking between two worlds that could never truly meet. The Hebrews, for their part, sometimes looked at Moses with a mixture of hope and distance. Some knew the story of the baby in the basket, drawn from the water by the princess, and they wondered if this privileged prince remembered the pain of his own people. Others whispered that perhaps, one day, he might be the one who would bring change, the one who would stand up for those whose voices had been silenced for so long. And so, as the years passed, Moses lived a life filled with blessings and burdens, laughter and loneliness, knowledge and uncertainty. By day, he wore the robes of an Egyptian noble, walking with princes and generals, learning all the wisdom and power the palace could offer. But by night, he listened for the distant cries of the Hebrews and dreamed of a world where slaves might one day be free. In this delicate balance, a quiet fire began to burn within him, a fire of justice, of longing, and of destiny, not yet revealed. All of Egypt might have seen Moses as a prince, but deep inside, a very different story was slowly unfolding, one that would shape not only his own life, but the fate of an entire nation. As Moses entered the fullness of manhood, the tension between his two worlds grew harder to ignore. His heart, shaped by the love and quiet strength of his Hebrew family, could not turn away from the suffering he witnessed beyond the palace gates. Each morning, as he walked among the towering columns and shaded courtyards, he carried with him the memory of the Hebrew slave sheaves, true people bending under the weight of their burdens, the cracks of whips echoing across the fields, their eyes lowered but never defeated. The palace itself, with its gold and laughter and feasts, felt increasingly distant, as if he were an honored guest in a place where he would never fully belong. The stories his mother had whispered long ago came back to him at unexpected moments, filling him with longing and quiet resolve. One day, the call to action could no longer be ignored. Moses ventured out among the people and saw, with painful clarity, the depth of their suffering. It was then, in the burning sun and thick dust, that he witnessed a sight that shook him to his core. An Egyptian overseer, his face twisted with cruelty and impatience, was beating a Hebrew slave without mercy, his blows falling like thunder on the man's back. Moses felt a surge of righteous anger. a deep and sudden conviction that this injustice could not stand, not today, not while he watched. Moved by an overwhelming sense of duty and kinship, Moses intervened. The moment was quick and desperate, a flash of movement and heartache. In the struggle, Moses struck the Egyptian, and the man fell lifeless in the sand. A cold stillness followed, as if the world itself had drawn in a breath. The gravity of what he had done sank in immediately. He looked around to see if anyone had witnessed the act, and, seeing no one, he quickly buried the Egyptian's body in the sand, hoping to hide what had happened. But secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of rising again. The following day, Moses walked among the Hebrews once more and saw two of his own people quarreling. He tried to break up the fight, appealing to their sense of brotherhood and peace. Yet one man turned on him, his voice sharp and accusing. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" In that instant, Moses realized his actions were not hidden. Word of what he had done had already spread like wildfire through the camps and fields, and now even Pharaoh himself would surely know. Fear swept over Moses, fear so profound it left his hands trembling and his heart pounding in his chest. He had always lived on the edge of two worlds, but now, in a single moment, he had lost them both. He could no longer remain in the palace, nor could he find safety among his own people. Pharaoh's wrath would be swift and deadly, and there was no one left to protect him. Moses fled into the wilderness, leaving behind the life he had always known. He journeyed alone through the burning sands and shifting dunes, with only the distant memory of home to comfort him. Each step into the wild was a step into the unknown, a place where the harsh sun and cold night winds were his only companions. For days he wandered, hungry and exhausted, until at last he reached the land of Midian, a quiet and distant place far from the reach of Pharaoh and the pain of his old life. There, by a well, in the shadow of distant mountains, Moses sat down to rest. He watched as the daughters of a local priest named Jethro came to draw water for their flocks, only to be driven away by rough shepherds. Even weary and in exile, Moses could not stand by in the face of injustice. He rose, defended the women, and helped them water their sheep. Grateful for his kindness, the women brought Moses to their father, who welcomed him warmly into their home. In Midian, Moses found unexpected peace. He married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, and settled into the quiet rhythm of tending sheep and living simply among gentle hills and whispering winds. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, he remembered all he had left behind: the bustling palace, the cries of his people, the uncertain future. Yet in the silence of the desert, he also discovered a sense of belonging he had never known before. The wilderness was a place of healing, a place where wounds slowly closed and hearts learned to hope again. Moses learned the ways of the land, the patterns of the seasons, and the quiet patience of shepherds. Still, deep inside, a small flame continued to burn, a sense that his journey was far from over, that the God of his ancestors was not yet finished with him. And so Moses lived, day by day, in a land far from Egypt, waiting for the next chapter of his life to unfold, not knowing that his greatest calling was still to come. The land of Midian stretched out under a vast, open sky, a quiet place of rolling hills, rocky outcrops, and hidden streams winding through pockets of green. Here, the worries and dangers of Egypt seemed to fall away with each passing day. For Moses, it was a world utterly unlike the marble halls and crowded markets of his youth. Instead of the shouts of overseers and the clang of tools, he listened to the gentle bleating of sheep and the wind rustling through grass and thorn bush. Life was simple, measured by the sun's slow arc across the sky and the coming and going of the seasons. In this solitude, Moses learned patience, the kind that comes from watching the same flock day after day, guiding them to water, sheltering them from sudden storms, or leading them up rocky paths in search of good pasture. Jethro, the priest of Midian and father of Moses' wife Zipporah, became both a mentor and a friend. Around the evening fire, Jethro shared the wisdom of the land, speaking of the desert's secrets, its beauty and dangers, its gifts and lessons. He spoke of God, too, not the distant, many-faced gods of Egypt, but the one who watched over every living thing, who heard the prayers of those lost or lonely or seeking hope. Moses listened closely, finding comfort in these words, for they echoed the stories his own mother had whispered so long ago. In the warmth of his new family, Moses began to heal. He grew to love Zipporah, whose laughter could fill a room and whose kindness was as steady as the stars. They built a life together, humble but rich in meaning, and before long they welcomed their first childer son Moses, named Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." The days flowed on, gentle and unhurried, shaped by routines as old as time. Moses rose with the dawn, gathered his staff, and led his sheep out to graze, following ancient trails across the hills. At noon, he rested in the shade, listening to the distant sound of flowing water or watching hawks circle lazily overhead. In the evenings, he returned to the small house he shared with Zipporah and Gershom, grateful for the warmth of family and the peace that had finally settled over his heart. Yet, even as the land of Midian grew familiar and its people became his own, Moses sometimes found himself gazing east, toward Egypt, his thoughts drifting back to another life. He wondered about his family, about the Hebrew people, still laboring under Pharaoh's yoke, about the purpose behind his journey from prince to shepherd. The desert had stripped away his titles and his fears, leaving behind a man who was humble, wise, and open to the whispers of God. Sometimes at night, when the stars burned bright and the world was utterly silent, Moses walked alone beyond the tents and flocks, feeling small beneath the endless sky. He spoke quietly to God, not with the grand words of Pharaoh's priests, but with honesty, longing, and trust. In these moments, the ache in his heart softened, replaced by the sense that he was being shaped for something only God could see. Years passed in this way. Moses grew older, his hands calloused and strong, his spirit patient and calm. The shepherd's crook became his daily companion, and the rhythm of life in Midian molded him in ways the palace never could. Here, among gentle hills and a loving family, Moses found a peace he had never known, though he could never quite silence the hope that one day the story of his people would take a different turn, and that somehow he might play a part in it. Through all the quiet years, Moses did not realize how close he stood to the edge of destiny, or how the ordinary days of tending sheep and loving his family were preparing him for a calling greater than anything he had ever imagined. For in the wilderness, as the past faded gently into memory, something new was beginning to stir, something that would change not only Moses' life, but the lives of his people forever. One morning, as Moses guided his flock through the quiet valleys and sunlit hills of Midian, the world felt calm and familiar. The sheep wandered contentedly, searching for patches of tender grass among rocks and thorns, their bells softly chiming in the breeze. The sky stretched above, an endless canopy of blue, and in the distance, the rugged slopes of Mount Horeb rose up, mysterious and silent. It was a place Moses had passed by many times, a lonely mountain standing watch over the wilderness, its shadows deep and cool in the early light. There was nothing, at first, to suggest that this day would be different from any other, that it would become the day Moses' life would be changed forever. Yet, as Moses drew near to Horeb, something strange caught his eye, a sudden flicker of movement, a brightness that shimmered even in the full glare of the sun. In a thicket of dry, tangled branches stood a bush, ablaze with fire, its flames burning bright and hot. But as Moses watched, he realized that the bush was not consumed. The green leaves did not shrivel, the wood did not blacken, and the fire danced over every twig without leaving a mark. It was as if the bush were alive with a power all its own, the flames both beautiful and mysterious. Curiosity drew Moses closer. He stepped quietly, half wondering if his eyes were playing tricks on him in the desert heat, half feeling that he stood on the edge of a mystery greater than anything he had known. The air around him seemed to hum with quiet energy, and even the sheep stilled, sensing something sacred. Then, out of the heart of the flames, came a voice clear and gentle, yet filled with majesty, that made Moses' heart leap and his knees tremble. The voice spoke his name, "Moses, Moses," he answered with wonder and awe. "Here I am," the voice said. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses knelt in the dust, overwhelmed by a sense of awe and fear. He listened as the voice spoke again, telling him, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At these words, Moses hid his face, unable to look upon the mystery burning before him, for he knew he was in the presence of the Almighty. God spoke to Moses with compassion and authority, saying, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." The promise rang in Moses' heart like a bell. Yet even as hope stirred, God's next words filled him with wonder and fear. "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." The task seemed impossible, far beyond the strength of one man. Moses' heart pounded as he tried to find words. Why should Pharaoh listen to him, a man who had fled Egypt as a fugitive, a shepherd living in exile, far from power and influence? Moses asked, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" But God answered with a promise that echoed through every fear. "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Still, Moses could not imagine how the Hebrews or the Egyptians would believe that he had truly been sent by God. He asked, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' What shall I tell them?" God replied with words that would shape history. "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." He told Moses to gather the elders of Israel and to trust that God himself would stretch out his hand, striking Egypt with wonders until Pharaoh finally let the people go. But Moses' doubts lingered. He worried that no one would listen, that his words would fail, that his voice was slow and uncertain. He pleaded, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." God answered with gentle firmness, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Yet still, Moses hesitated, his heart caught between fear and calling. God, seeing his uncertainty, offered comfort. "What about your brother, Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and his heart will be glad when he sees you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do." At last, with the fire of the burning bush flickering in his memory and the promise of God ringing in his soul, Moses accepted the task. He gathered his staff, the same humble shepherd's staff that had guided sheep through rocky paths, now to become a symbol of power and deliverance. The mountain, once just a silent witness to his days of wandering, had become holy ground, a place where the ordinary was touched by the extraordinary, and a simple shepherd was called to lead a nation out of bondage. With each step back toward his home, Moses felt the weight and wonder of his new calling, aware that his life would never be the same. And as he journeyed through the desert, the memory of the voice in the fire stayed with him, a guiding light in the darkness, a promise that no matter how great the task ahead, he would never be alone. Moses returned from the slopes of Mount Horeb with a sense of awe and urgency burning inside him, as if the encounter with the living God had changed every fiber of his being. The ordinary staff in his hand felt different, now a sign of purpose rather than routine. His heart beat with a mix of hope and dread, for he knew that his quiet days of solitude were at an end. The task before him was clear but daunting: to return to the land he had fled, to stand before the most powerful ruler in the world, and to speak on behalf of an enslaved people. The journey itself was long and difficult, the path winding through deserts and stony hills, each step a reminder of the promise that had been spoken from the flames. Moses prepared his family, gathering Zipporah and his sons, and entrusted them to God's care. As he traveled, doubts would creep in, whispers of fear and memories of his own failures in Egypt. But the memory of the burning bush and the sound of God's voice steadied him, guiding his steps. Along the way, Moses met his brother, Aaron, just as God had promised. The reunion was filled with relief and wonder, for so many years had passed since they last saw each other, and both carried the deep ache of separation. Aaron listened as Moses shared everything: the vision on the mountain, the words God had spoken, the miracles he had witnessed. Together, they strengthened one another, for Aaron's gift of speech and Moses' steadfastness made them a powerful pair. As they neared Egypt, a feeling of destiny pressed upon them. Each day, as they drew closer to the land of their birth, the memories of their people's suffering became sharper and more painful. Moses remembered the long lines of slaves at the brickyards, the hollow eyes of children, the cries that rose to heaven with every crack of the overseer's whip. When they arrived in Egypt, Moses and Aaron sought out the elders of Israel. They gathered the leaders in a quiet place, far from the watchful eyes of the Egyptians, and shared all that God had told them. The elders listened as Aaron spoke with passion, telling the story of the burning bush, the promise of deliverance, and the signs that God had given. Moses performed wonders before them, turning his staff into a serpent and back again, making his hand appear leprous and then whole, and the people believed. For the first time in many years, a spark of hope was kindled in their hearts, a belief that God had heard their prayers, and that freedom might be more than just a distant dream. Strengthened by this new hope, Moses and Aaron went before Pharaoh, the ruler of all Egypt, whose word was law and whose heart was hard as stone. The palace was just as Moses remembered, filled with gold and grandeur, but the weight of its power seemed even greater now. Moses stood tall, Aaron at his side, and spoke the words God had commanded. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh listened, his expression growing cold and mocking. He did not know this God, and he had no intention of releasing his slaves. Instead, he accused Moses and Aaron of distracting the Hebrews from their work and ordered the overseers to increase their burdens. No longer would the Egyptians provide straw for making bricks. The slaves must gather it themselves, yet still produce the same number of bricks each day. The people groaned under the new weight, their hope threatened by the reality of even harsher labor. Some turned on Moses and Aaron in frustration, blaming them for their suffering. Moses, feeling the weight of their pain, cried out to God, asking why things had become even more difficult. But God's answer was patient and steady, assuring Moses that Pharaoh's resistance would only serve to reveal the greatness of God's power. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh," God promised. "Because of my mighty hand he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand he will drive them out of his country." So Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh again and again, repeating God's command, each time met with the same refusal, each time warning of what would come if Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The court of Pharaoh was filled with magicians and counselors, men skilled in tricks and spells, but none could match the power that Moses carried with him, the quiet, unstoppable force of a promise given in fire. Moses learned to trust not in himself, but in the God who had chosen him, and with every encounter, his courage grew. The days ahead would be marked by struggle and miracle, heartbreak and hope, as Moses took his place at the center of a story that would echo through the ages. Yet even as the palace doors closed behind him and the murmurs of the court faded into silence, Moses knew that the God who spoke from the burning bush was with him still, guiding his every step, and that the deliverance of his people would come, no matter how impossible it seemed. The struggle between Moses and Pharaoh unfolded like a storm over the land of Egypt, its tension building with each passing day. Each time Moses and Aaron entered the grand halls of Pharaoh's palace, the air was heavy with expectation. Moses stood before the throne, repeating God's command with unwavering resolve, "Let my people go, that they may serve me." But Pharaoh's heart was unmoved, his eyes filled with pride, and he dismissed the words of Moses as if they were nothing more than the whispers of the wind. He refused to acknowledge the God of the Hebrews, and with each refusal, a sense of foreboding settled over Egypt, as if the land itself braced for what would come next. Then, with a solemn warning, the signs and wonders began. Moses stretched out his staff over the waters of the Nile, and the great river, lifeblood of Egypt, ran red with blood. Fish died and floated to the surface, and the stench filled every corner of the land. People dug along the banks for fresh water, but found none. Still, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Then came a plague of frogs, leaping from the river and spreading into every home, every palace, every kitchen and bedchamber. The people could not escape them. Their very lives seemed to be overrun by the chaos. Yet again, Pharaoh promised to let the people go, only to change his mind as soon as relief came. As Pharaoh wavered, another plague swept through Egypt. Tiny gnats rose from the dust and covered people and animals alike, their constant biting a torment that could not be swatted away. After the gnats came swarms of flies, filling the houses and covering the ground, their buzzing a reminder that something unnatural had invaded the land. Despite the growing misery, Pharaoh clung to his power, his pride as strong as the stone walls around him. But Egypt's suffering did not end. A devastating disease struck the livestock, and the animal cows, goats, horses, and sheep fell dead in the fields. Yet in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, the flocks and herds remained untouched, a sign that the God of Moses could make distinctions the gods of Egypt could not. Still, Pharaoh did not yield. Then, without warning, painful boils broke out on the skin of every Egyptian, sores that brought agony and fear. Even the magicians of Pharaoh's court, who once had tried to imitate Moses' miracles, now stood powerless and broken, unable to heal themselves or offer comfort. Yet, though Egypt groaned under the weight of pain, Pharaoh's heart remained like iron. The sky darkened as a storm of hail swept through the land, thunder crashing and lightning flashing as ice fell, destroying crops and shattering trees. Fire ran along the ground, mingling with hail, a spectacle so fierce that even the bravest trembled. Still, Pharaoh wavered, pleading for relief, but refusing true freedom for the Israelites. The destruction continued. Once the hail ceased, locusts poured across the fields, their numbers like a living cloud, devouring every green leaf and blade of grass that survived the storm. In a matter of hours, Egypt's land, once rich and beautiful, was stripped bare, its people left hungry and anxious. When the locusts were gone, a heavy darkness settled over the land, so thick that even oil lamps could not drive it away. For 3 days, the people lived in gloom, unable to see even their own hands, fear spreading like a chill through every home. Yet even in this darkness, there was light in the dwellings of the Hebrews, a sign that their God stood watch over them while Egypt despaired. With each new plague, Pharaoh's resolve would waver, his promises made in desperation and broken as soon as hope returned. Moses stood firm, returning again and again to deliver God's message, his spirit unbroken by Pharaoh's stubbornness. Each plague was both a warning and a lesson, a demonstration of power far beyond anything Egypt's magicians could imagine, and a call to humble the proud. The people of Egypt, once secure in their might, now trembled with uncertainty, and even the greatest among them began to wonder at the God of the Hebrews. Yet through it all, the Hebrews waited, their faith tested by suffering and delay, their hearts aching for the freedom that seemed just beyond reach. Each day, Moses carried their hopes and their fears as he walked into Pharaoh's palace, knowing that deliverance was drawing nearer, yet that the night would grow darkest before the dawn. In the silent hours between plagues, all of Egypt held its breath, waiting for what would come next, as if the land itself knew that a great change was at hand. As the land of Egypt reeled from one calamity after another, hope and dread mixed in the hearts of all who waited for what might come next. The people whispered among themselves, haunted by the devastation of the plagues, and even the most faithful wondered if there could be anything worse. But in the quiet that followed the darkness, a stillness settled over the land, thick with anticipation and fear. Moses, guided by the hand of God, knew the final moment had arrived, a night unlike any other, a night that would forever mark the memory of generations. God spoke to Moses and Aaron, instructing them to prepare the Israelites for what was to come. Each Hebrew family was to choose a spotless lamb, to care for it for a few days, and then, as evening fell, to gather together in their homes. The lamb was to be sacrificed, its blood carefully brushed on the doorposts and lintels of every Hebrew dwelling. This blood, a sign of trust and obedience, would set their homes apart, a silent shield against the sorrow about to sweep through Egypt. The families gathered inside, sharing a sacred meal of roasted lamb, bitter herbs, and unleavened bread baked in haste, for there would be no time to let it rise. They ate standing, their sandals on their feet and staffs in their hands, ready to depart at a moment's notice. Outside, the night deepened, the world hushed as if the air itself waited for what would come. The Hebrews spoke in whispers, their children gathered close, every heart pounding with a mixture of fear and faith. They clung to the words Moses had spoken, words passed from house to house, promising that God himself would pass through the land, and that wherever he saw the blood on the doors, he would pass over, sparing those within from harm. Then, in the deepest hours of the night, a cry arose across Egypt, a cry so piercing, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. In every Egyptian home, from the grand palaces of the rich to the humblest cottages, the firstborn son lay still, their lives suddenly taken in an act of judgment that none could resist or understand. From Pharaoh's own palace, where his son lay in the arms of weeping servants, to the prisoners in the dungeons, not a house was untouched by grief. The anguish was overwhelming, an echo of all the suffering and sorrow the Hebrews had endured for generations. But in the homes marked by the blood, there was peace, a sacred protection, a moment when God's promise stood firm in the darkness. Pharaoh, broken by loss and humbled as never before, summoned Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. His words, once hard and proud, now trembled with sorrow and urgency. "Get up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds and go. And also, bless me." The Egyptians urged the Hebrews to hurry, desperate for an end to their suffering, pressing gifts of silver, gold, and clothing upon them as they departed. In the first pale light of dawn, the Israelites gathered in haste, their numbers great, carrying with them only what they could pack, and the memory of a night both terrible and holy. The sounds of wailing and mourning faded behind them as they left the land that had been both a home and a prison. For generations they had waited, and now, at last, the moment of freedom had come. Mothers held their children close, elders walked with tears of gratitude streaming down their faces, and all eyes turned toward the horizon, where a new day was beginning. Though they marched into the unknown, the Hebrews carried with them the memory of that night, the sign of the blood, and the taste of unleavened bread, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, hope is born, and that faith, when tested, can open the way to freedom. The Exodus had begun, and the story of Israel was forever changed. The sun rose on a changed Egypt, casting long golden rays over a land left in sorrow and wonder. The Hebrews, newly freed from centuries of bondage, found themselves gathering under the wide sky, the coolness of early morning wrapping around them like a promise. Families huddled together, bundles of belongings strapped to their backs, their faces marked with awe, relief, and uncertainty. Children clung to their parents, asking whispered questions, and the elders murmured prayers of gratitude. For generations, their people had known only toil and chains, but now they stood on the edge of a new life, their hearts pounding with hope and fear mingled together. Under Moses' steady leadership, the people moved out, guided by a cloud that glowed with God's presence by day and a pillar of fire by night. The crowd was vast, a river of humanity flowing through fields and villages, joined by flocks of sheep and herds of cattle, their every step echoing with the memory of all they had lost and all they dreamed to find. Some carried precious relics from their past Joseph's bones, kept safe through the years, a symbol of faith that the promise made long ago would now be fulfilled. Others, carried nothing but bread for the journey and a heart full of questions. Yet all moved forward, each step carrying them farther from the land of Pharaoh and closer to the mystery of freedom. As they journeyed, the desert wind rose, tugging at their robes and filling the air with the scent of dust and wildflowers. Sometimes the youngest among them grew tired, and parents carried their little ones, whispering gentle songs to keep their spirits bright. At night, the pillar of fire blazed on the horizon, a beacon of safety and hope, its warmth a reminder that God Himself walked before them. And as they pressed onward, the memory of slavery slowly began to loosen its grip, replaced by cautious joy and stories shared around campfires under the stars. But soon, word reached the people that Pharaoh's heart had hardened once more. The might of Egypt was thundering behind them, chariots and soldiers, horses and banners, the full power of the kingdom determined to bring them back. Fear swept through the camp like a sudden storm, voices rising in panic as the people realized they were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the impassable waters of the Red Sea. Mothers gathered their children, men gripped their staffs, and the cry went up, "Why did you bring us here to die? Were there not graves enough in Egypt?" Despair threatened to overwhelm the fragile hope that had carried them this far. Yet, Moses stood firm, his eyes fixed on the sea and the cloud of God's presence hovering above. He spoke with quiet authority, urging the people not to be afraid, but to stand still and watch the salvation of the Lord. The wind began to rise, stronger and colder, whipping the surface of the sea into churning waves. Moses stretched out his staff over the water, and the sea began to split, the waters rising like shimmering walls on either side, leaving a path of dry land straight through the heart of the deep. In stunned silence, the people stepped forward, moving between the walls of water, their footsteps quickening with every stride as they crossed beneath the star-strewn sky. Behind them, the army of Pharaoh thundered in pursuit, but as the last Israelite stepped onto the far shore, the walls of water crashed back together with a sound like thunder, swallowing chariots, horses, and soldiers in a single breath. The people stood together, trembling and amazed, staring at the place where the sea had been their shield. In that moment, joy burst forth, a song of deliverance rising from their hearts, led by Miriam, Moses' sister, who took a tambourine in her hand and led the women in dance. The song echoed across the water and into the memory of every soul. "Sing to the Lord, for He has triumphed gloriously. The horse and rider He has thrown into the sea." In the days that followed, as the people continued their journey into the wilderness, they carried with them the memory of that night by the sea, terror of being trapped, the wonder of deliverance, and the joy of freedom. They would face many trials and hardships, yet in every struggle, the story of the crossing would remind them that even when hope seems lost and the way is blocked, faith can part the waters and open a path where none was seen before. The story of the Exodus, marked by courage, fear, miracles, and music, had only just begun, but already it shone in their hearts like a promise that would never be forgotten. The desert stretched out before the Israelites, vast and endless, its hills rolling beneath the heat of the sun, its winds carrying the scent of sand and distant rain. The people, freed from bondage and delivered through the sea, now found themselves in a world that was both new and daunting. The wilderness was nothing like the land they had left behind. Here, there were no cities or familiar landmarks, only endless sky above and the ever-changing patterns of dunes and rock below. Each day began with the gathering of the camp, the pillar of cloud lifting and moving before them, and the people following, uncertain but determined. The nights were cold and quiet, stars blazing in the darkness, and stories were whispered around small fires, memories of Egypt mingling with dreams of the land ahead. At first, hope and gratitude filled every heart, for the miracle at the Red Sea was still fresh in their minds, a song of deliverance echoing in their ears. Yet as days turned to weeks, hunger and thirst began to gnaw at their resolve. The desert offered no fields of grain, no wells of cool water. The people cried out to Moses, their voices rising with worry and fear, "Why have you brought us out here to die of hunger and thirst?" Some longed for the food of Egypt, even as they remembered the bitterness of slavery. Moses, feeling the weight of their cries, prayed to God, asking for help and mercy, and God heard. One morning, as the dew evaporated, a mysterious, fine, flake-like substance covered the ground. The people stared in wonder and asked each other, "What is it?" Moses told them this was bread from heaven, a gift for each new day. They called it manna, gathering just enough for their families, learning to trust that each morning there would be more. Still, the journey was hard, and thirst soon followed hunger. At Marah, the only water was bitter and undrinkable, but God instructed Moses to cast a piece of wood into the springs, and the water became sweet, saving the people from despair. Later, when they camped at Rephidim and found no water at all, tempers flared and hope faltered. Once again, Moses prayed, and God told him to strike a rock with his staff. As he obeyed, fresh water poured forth, gushing into the dust, quenching the thirst of thousands and their animals, a miracle in the heart of the wilderness. As they traveled on, other challenges arose. The Amalekites attacked, hoping to defeat the tired travelers and scatter them across the sands. Moses climbed a hilltop, staff in hand, and as he lifted it high, the Israelites prevailed. When his arms grew tired, Aaron and Hur stood beside him, holding up his hands until sunset, and the people won their first victory as a free nation. Along the way, disputes and questions filled the camp. People brought their problems to Moses, who listened and judged from morning until evening. When his father-in-law, Jethro, visited and saw how overwhelmed Moses had become, he suggested sharing the burden, appointing trustworthy leaders to help guide and care for the people. Moses listened, grateful for wise counsel, and the camp began to function more smoothly, the people learning to rely on one another as well as on God. Throughout the long days and nights, a new sense of identity began to form. No longer slaves, the people of Israel were learning what it meant to be a national community, guided not by Pharaoh's whip, but by faith, shared struggles, and the promise of a land flowing with milk and honey. Each hardship became a lesson, each miracle a reminder that they were not alone, no matter how vast or wild the wilderness seemed. The journey was slow, sometimes circling back on itself, sometimes forging ahead into the unknown, but with every step, the people grew stronger in body and spirit. Even when doubts returned and voices rose in complaint, Moses turned again and again to the God who had called him, the God who had heard the cries of slaves and now led a people toward freedom. The wilderness, with all its dangers and tests, was also a place of hope, a place where old fears were left behind, where new trust could take root, and where the promise of a new beginning shone brighter with each rising sun. And so the journey continued, through days of hardship and nights of peace, a people transformed by the steady presence of a God who never left them, not even for a moment, as they walked together toward the land that would one day be their own. At last, after many days of wandering, the Israelites came to the foot of a great and ancient mountain, Mount Sinai, its rugged peaks rising into the sky, cloaked in mist and awe. The people made camp in the wide plain below, their tents scattered across the ground like stars fallen from the heavens. The pillar of cloud, always their guide, now hovered above the mountain, thick and mysterious, as if holding a secret meant only for those who truly listened. There was a sense of anticipation, of something momentous about to unfold, and even the youngest child could feel the air tremble with promise and wonder. Here, in the shadow of Sinai, God was about to draw near in a way the people had never known, inviting them into a covenant that would bind them together as a people and set their destiny apart from all others. God called to Moses from within the cloud, summoning him to ascend the mountain. Moses climbed the rocky path, leaving behind the camp and its noise, stepping into the silence and solitude where only the wind whispered among the stones. As he reached the heights, the mountain was wrapped in thunder and lightning, the ground trembling beneath his feet, and the air filled with the sound of a trumpet that grew louder and louder. There, in the midst of smoke and fire, God spoke to Moses not in riddles or dreams, but in words clear and strong, words that would echo through the ages. God revealed his desire, that the people would be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, set apart to shine light in the world. Moses returned to the camp, his face radiant, and shared God's words with the people. The Israelites listened, their hearts pounding with both fear and excitement, and they answered as one, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Days of preparation followed. The people washed their clothes and readied themselves, drawing near the mountain but never daring to touch it, for it had become holy ground. On the third day, as the sun broke over the peaks, the mountain was wreathed in smoke and flame. Thunder rolled, lightning flashed, and the voice of God sounded like a mighty trumpet, calling the people to attention. Moses alone was invited to draw near, entering the cloud and standing in the presence of the holy. There, God gave Moses the gift that would shape a nation, the 10 Commandments. Written by the very finger of God on tablets of stone, these words set out the foundation for a just and compassionate life. "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet." Each commandment was like a lamp, casting light on how to live together, how to love God and neighbor, how to build a society rooted in respect, dignity, and faith. While Moses lingered on the mountain, surrounded by cloud and glory, God spoke to him of many things of justice and mercy, of worship and rest, of how the people should build a sanctuary so that God could dwell among them. He described the design of the tabernacle, a portable place of worship where the people could offer prayers and sacrifices, a sign that God was not distant but present in every step of their journey. God gave instructions for the Ark of the Covenant, a chest to hold the tablets of stone, a reminder of the promise that bound God and Israel together. The days stretched on as Moses listened and learned, his heart filled with awe and responsibility. But while Moses was gone, the people below grew restless. Fearing that their leader might never return, they gathered around Aaron and pleaded for something tangible, something they could see and touch. Aaron collected gold from the people and fashioned a calf, an idol like those of Egypt, and the people offered sacrifices and danced, forgetting the promise they had just made. When Moses descended the mountain, carrying the stone tablets, he saw the people in chaos, and grief struck his heart. In righteous anger, he shattered the tablets, mourning how quickly his people had turned away. But even in this moment of failure, God's mercy prevailed. Moses pleaded for forgiveness, and God listened, renewing the covenant and inviting Moses back to the mountain, where the tablets were given anew. From that day, the 10 Commandments became the heart of the nation, written not only on stone, but upon the hearts of the people. They were a guide in times of confusion, a comfort in times of fear, and a promise that even in the wilderness, they were not alone. Moses returned to the camp, his face shining so brightly from being in God's presence that the people could barely look at him. From then on, Moses became the bridge between God and Israel, teaching, leading, and reminding the people of the covenant they had entered together at Sinai. The mountain remained, silent and strong, a witness to the promise made in fire and thunder. The people packed up their camp, gathered their families, and continued their journey, each one changed by what had happened at Sinai. The laws and stories given there would be told and retold, shaping their identity for generations, guiding their steps through the wilderness and beyond. And through it all, the memory of Sinai, the mountain of meeting, the place where God spoke and hearts were bound together, remained a source of hope and strength for all who longed for justice, peace, and the presence of the holy. Life in the wilderness became a long, winding path, stretching across years and seasons, shaped by uncertainty and marked by countless lessons. After the wonder and awe of Sinai, the people of Israel found themselves once again facing the realities of desert living days, of blazing sun and restless winds, nights filled with silence and stars, and a journey that seemed to have no end. The land they moved through was harsh and unforgiving. At times, water was scarce, and the memory of thirst haunted them. At other times, Hunger gnawed at their resolve, even though manna still appeared with the morning dew. The people traveled as one, a great community wandering together, each family carrying their hopes, fears, and burdens. In the evenings, as campfires flickered under the sky, parents told their children the stories of deliverance, the plagues, the Red Sea, the voice of God on the mountain reminding them that they were not just wanderers, but a chosen people with a purpose and a promise. But even with these reminders, old doubts surfaced. The journey was long, and the unknown stretched ahead like a shadow. Sometimes, voices of fear and complaint grew loud, drowning out the memory of miracles. There were moments when the people quarreled, blaming Moses for their hardships and longing for the comforts of Egypt, even as they remembered its chains. Why did we leave? Some would ask. Wouldn't it have been better to stay in Egypt, where at least we had bread and meat? In those times, Moses turned to God with heavy heart, praying for patience and guidance. And God, ever faithful, would answer with grace, bringing forth water from a rock, sending quail to satisfy their hunger, and providing healing for those who were sick or bitten by serpents in the sand. Challenges came not only from within, but also from without. Along the way, neighboring tribes and kings grew wary of this growing multitude, sometimes responding with suspicion or outright hostility. There were battles to be fought, moments when the people had to trust not just in their own strength, but in the God who fought for them. In each trial, Moses served as their guide and intercessor, lifting prayers for protection, wisdom, and mercy. In his quiet moments, he listened for God's voice, seeking direction in the silence of the desert. Yet, through every hardship, something deep and lasting began to grow among the people, a sense of identity, stronger than any fear. They were learning what it meant to be a nation, not just a group bound by shared suffering, but by shared faith, law, and hope. Leaders were appointed to help Moses bear the burden of judgment and teaching. The tabernacle stood at the heart of their camp, its presence a daily reminder that God was with them, moving as they moved, resting as they rested. Festivals and Sabbaths gave rhythm to their days, moments of celebration, remembrance, and rest in the midst of endless travel. There was laughter in the camp, children running and playing, women weaving and singing, men sharing stories and dreams by firelight. The wilderness, though difficult, was becoming a place of transformation. Still, there were times of sorrow. The memory of Sinai and the giving of the law sometimes felt distant as the people stumbled and fell, forgetting the promises they had made. There were episodes of rebellion, moments when some challenged Moses' leadership, or when the people turned their hearts to old idols or ways. Each time, Moses pleaded with God for mercy, reminding him of the covenant, the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God's response was both just and compassionate, offering discipline when needed, but always opening the door to forgiveness and a new beginning. As the years passed, the wilderness itself became part of their story, a place of wandering and waiting, but also of growth and grace. New generations were born who had never known Egypt, who grew up listening to the tales of plagues and miracles, learning to trust in a future they had not seen. The journey shaped them, leaving behind the old patterns of slavery and forging a people ready for the responsibilities of freedom. Through failure and forgiveness, loss and new hope, the Israelites were slowly being prepared for the promise that still awaited them beyond the horizon. In every hardship and every joy, God's presence remained, sometimes felt in fire and cloud, sometimes in a whisper, always faithful, always leading them forward. And so the wandering continued, each day another step on a journey from fear to faith, from captivity to covenant, from longing to belonging. The years in the wilderness shaped a generation, their memories woven with longing, struggle, and hope. At last, the endless journey brought the people of Israel to the edge of a dream, the border of the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Across the Jordan River, they could see the rolling hills and green valleys, a land flowing with milk and honey, where clusters of grapes hung heavy on the vine and the wheat fields shone gold in the sun. The people gathered on the plains of Moab, their camp stretching out in a great sea of tents, the tabernacle at the center, gleaming in the dawn. There was a sense of excitement and wonder, but also a hush of uncertainty, for this was a moment unlike any before. Their journey, so long and filled with hardship, was about to give way to a new beginning, and with it came the weight of everything that had come before. Moses, now an old man, walked among the people, his hair silvered by the sun, and his face marked with wisdom and kindness. He looked upon those he had led for so many years, the children who had grown into leaders, the elders who remembered Egypt, the young ones who had known nothing but tents and desert wind. He saw their anticipation, their eagerness, their fear, and he gathered them together to speak words they would never forget. Moses climbed to a place where all could see and hear him, and his voice, though aged, was strong and clear. He reminded the people of their journey, how God had carried them out of slavery, through the parted sea, and across the wilderness. He spoke of the miracles and the hardships, of the times they had doubted and the times they had believed, of the laws given at Sinai and the covenant written on their hearts. He urged them to remember not just the victories, but also the failures, the moments of rebellion, and the grace that followed. Moses told them that the land before them was a gift, a fulfillment of promise, but it would not remain theirs unless they walked in faithfulness, loving God with all their heart and soul and strength. He spoke of justice and kindness, of caring for the stranger, the widow, and the orphan, reminding them that they were once strangers in Egypt, saved only by the mercy of God. His words rose and fell like music, painting a vision of a people who could become a light to the nations, a people set apart by their faith, humility, and compassion. Moses' heart ached with both pride and sorrow, for he knew he would not cross the river with them. God had told him that his journey would end here, on this side of the Jordan. The knowledge was bittersweet, for Moses had dreamed of this moment for so long, but he accepted it with grace, trusting that the story was greater than his own part in it. From the heights of Mount Nebo, Moses looked out across the valley, the river winding below, the land spreading out like a promise kept. He saw in his mind's eye the vineyards and olive groves, the cities and fields where his people would live and flourish. He thought of the children yet to be born, the stories yet to be told, and he blessed the people, one tribe at a time, speaking words of encouragement, hope, and destiny. The people wept as they listened, their hearts full of gratitude and sadness. They knew that Moses had been more than a leader. He was a shepherd, a teacher, and a friend. His faith had carried them through every darkness. His prayers had brought them mercy when they least deserved it, and his wisdom had guided them like a lamp in the night. As the sun set over the mountains and the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, the Israelites gathered together in silence, holding on to the words Moses had spoken, feeling the weight of the moment and the promise of tomorrow. Moses, alone with God, climbed the mountain one last time. There, in the quiet hush, he looked out over the land, his eyes bright with peace. He knew that he had done all he could, that the people were ready to begin again. As he breathed in the cool mountain air, surrounded by memories of fire, water, and wandering, Moses entrusted his people to God, the one who had never left their side. And though he would not set foot in the promised land, his spirit would go with them, woven into every story, every law, every hope for generations to come. The journey was not ending, but opening into something newer, future filled with promise, shaped by faith and the lessons of the wilderness, and forever blessed by the legacy of Moses. As the final rays of sunlight slipped behind the distant hills, a gentle quiet settled over the land. The Israelites, camped on the edge of the promised country, rested in a silence that felt full and sacred, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Moses' story, woven through every moment of their journey, was coming to its close. Yet even as his time on earth drew to an end, his spirit and legacy shone brighter than ever among his people, echoing in their songs, their prayers, and their hope for what lay ahead. On the slopes of Mount Nebo, Moses stood alone, surrounded by the hush of evening and the soft whisper of the wind. His eyes, still clear and strong despite the many years and countless trials, gazed out over the land stretched before him, land flowing with milk and honey, green valleys and distant mountains, a patchwork of promise that would soon become home to the children of Israel. As Moses looked back on his life, his thoughts wandered through all the chapters that had brought him to this moment. He remembered the rush of the Nile as a child, the palace halls filled with music and shadow, the day he fled Egypt with fear pounding in his chest. He saw again the quiet beauty of Midian, the gentle eyes of Zipporah, the endless days of shepherding under the open sky. He relived the wonder and terror of the burning bush, the first steps back to Egypt, the courage it took to stand before Pharaoh, and the power that had flowed through his staff in the face of every trial. Each memory was alive with meaning, not just for him, but for the entire nation that had walked this long road at his side. He recalled the nights in the wilderness, the sweet taste of manna, the thirst quenched by water from a rock, the laughter of children, and the weary questions of elders. He remembered the sound of the people singing by the sea, the awe on their faces as fire danced atop Mount Sinai, the long days spent teaching and judging, comforting and correcting, always turning back to God for wisdom and strength. Through every joy and every failure, Moses had seen God's faithfulness like a golden thread, sometimes dazzling, sometimes subtle, but always there, weaving a tapestry of redemption that would never be unraveled. Moses knew that he would not enter the land below, but this was not a source of regret. Instead, it filled him with gratitude. He had been entrusted with an impossible calling, and through his weakness, had witnessed a strength greater than any Pharaoh, a love deeper than any river or sea. He blessed the people one last time, tribe by tribe, speaking words of hope and courage over each, reminding them to remember their story, to keep the law close to their hearts, and to trust the God who had led them through the darkest valleys and brightest dawns. He urged them to care for the weak, to welcome the stranger, to seek justice and mercy in all things, so that the promise they had inherited would become a blessing for the world. As the night grew deeper, Moses' breath became slow and peaceful. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, filling the sky with a promise that was older than Abraham, older than the mountains themselves. In those final moments, Moses slipped quietly from this world, his spirit returning to the God who had called him from the water, who had spoken to him from the fire, who had walked beside him through every shadow and light. The people mourned him with tears and songs, honoring the man who had been their guide, their teacher, and their friend. Yet Moses' story did not end with his passing. It lived on in every heart that remembered the journey, in every child who learned the stories of deliverance and faith, in every act of kindness and courage that echoed his teachings. The law he had received at Sinai became the foundation of a people who would shape history, and his example of humility, patience, and trust in God became a light for generations yet unborn. The journey that began with one small baby hidden among the reeds became a legacy of freedom, hope, and purpose, stories still told wherever people long for justice, for mercy, and for a home of their own. So as sleep settles over your eyes and your mind drifts on the gentle winds of the night, let your heart rest in the quiet strength of this story. The life of Moses is a reminder that even the longest journeys are filled with meaning, that every struggle and every joy can become part of a greater promise, and that, wherever you are, the God who watched over Moses watches over you, still guiding, protecting, and calling you onward into peace.